What cold case or unsolved crime still gives you chills? Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès. He killed entire family and vanished. He has been looked for over a decade, and even today French media brings new info about his troubled past, money, and marriage problems. That gives you chills. The disappearance of Brian Schaffer. He went out drinking with friends, entered a bar, and never came out again. Nobody knows what happened to him, and there are no other exits inside. He just disappeared without a trace. Missy Bevers. The footage of her attacker wandering around the church in riot gear, waiting for her to arrive. Horrifying. The fact they are on crystal clear video, yet still have not been identified. Just WTF all around. This is one case that I always check in on every few months. Woman goes to a church at like 4 a.m. to teach a Zumba class and gets bludgeoned to death by someone wearing police riot gear. To this date, no arrests have been made, yet they have video of a suspect walking around all nonchalantly. The horror that woman must have felt gives me chills. The Watcher. In New Jersey, a family bought a house at 657 Boulevard and began receiving letters from an eloquent man who claimed to have inherited a family tradition of watching the house. The letters were not pleasant ones. The Isdal Woman. She was a foreign woman found burned to death at a remote area in Norway in 1970. She visited Norway twice in 1970, once in March 1970 and then in November 1970. The Isdal woman stayed at various hotels around Norway under several false names and supposedly possessed false passports. Hotel staff reported that she kept to herself and spoke to them in German and broken English. She was also witnessed conversing in French with a man at a hotel lobby. The Isdal woman stood out in Norway because she looked foreign and dressed very stylishly. She was also a lone woman staying in hotels, which was unusual in 1970. After her death, it was rumored that she was a spy from Israel or Russia. Nobody knows who she is and why she came to Norway. Her death was ruled as a suicide, though many investigators dispute this ruling. There's a fascinating podcast from the BBC on the Isdal woman, how they are still investigating her and the circumstances around her death. It's called Death in Ice Valley, and well worth the listen if you're into true crime mystery. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum Art Heist. On the night of March 18, 1990, museum guards allowed two men dressed as police officers to enter Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. They were fake cops and immediately tied up the guards and set about stealing 13 artworks worth $500 million. Despite the $10 million reward, the case remains unsolved. I actually work at this museum, and what's so frustrating is that everyone is pretty sure who did it. The Boston Mafia. They were planning to try and get info out of Whitey Bulger before he died, but what makes it so upsetting is that most likely these works, which were already irreparably damaged when they were taken out of the frames, were probably just left to sit in a basement or attic and are still there. The two most valuable works, of Vermeer and Rembrandt's Only Seascape, are instantly recognizable and will be semi-difficult to sell, unless they had a buyer set up, and the random nature of the theft seemed to indicate they didn't. They were probably just taken for some kind of insurance or power play use within the mafia. The latest tip from 2012 put the pieces in a shed that had been completely flooded and subsequently cleaned out. Even if that wasn't where they were, it seems likely that they were or are in a similar situation. The very first black drum major at Michigan State University disappeared one night and was never seen again. His wallet, car, and everything else he owned was left behind. He was supposed to appear in court to testify against someone who had stolen from him and beaten him up, and it is suspected that that person murdered him, but no evidence was ever found and no one came forward. The death of Magdalena Zuk. She was a Polish girl who bought tickets for both herself and her boyfriend to go to Egypt, but ended up going alone due to issues with her boyfriend's passport visa. Just a day after she arrived in Egypt, she seemingly lost her mind. She started acting strange and was taken to a private hospital while arrangements were made for her boyfriend's friend to come take her back to Poland. At the hospital, she made multiple attempts to jump out the window and had to be restrained. A nurse untied her so that she could go to the bathroom, and apparently Magda made a final fatal dash for the window. She was taken to a larger hospital but died hours later. You can find recordings of her video call with her boyfriend, which clearly shows her being paranoid and jumpy. When asked what the problem was, besides phrases like, "They have all sorts of tricks here, and I'll never get out of here," all she said was one letter, M. Her boyfriend's name started with M. Her tour guide's name started with M. The name of the friend who was being sent to her also started with M, if I remember correctly. So there really is no way to know what the whole thing was about. She also said something along the lines of, "They're watching me, I can't talk." What made Magda act strangely? Why was she so scared? Why did she jump out of a window? Did she even jump out on her own accord? Was she pushed off? Another girl who was associated with her boyfriend also died under suspicious circumstances, but I couldn't find much more on that in English. The Atlas Vampire. In 1932, a woman living alone in Stockholm was found bludgeoned to death in her apartment. The discovery of a blood-covered gravy ladle led police to believe that they had found the murder weapon, but this was not the case. The murderer had used it to drink her blood and had successfully drained the corpse of nearly all liquid before fleeing the scene. Giulio Regini was an Italian university student from Cambridge. He was doing some research in Egypt for the American University in Cairo, and he wrote some articles with a pseudonym about the 2011 Egyptian Revolution. His dead and mutilated body was found on the side of a road outside Cairo on February 3rd, 2016. He had signs on his body that indicated he was brutally tortured. Broken ribs and fingers, both legs, arms, and 5 teeth. He was probably killed by the Egyptian Secret Services. We still don't know the truth about his death, and the Egyptian government still hasn't done anything to help Italy solve the case. This made and makes me realize how dangerous some countries in the world are today. Claudia Cushach, a journalist going to a press trip in Havana, Cuba, didn't make it to her destination. The 29-year-old stayed at the Sandals Beach Resort in Negril, Jamaica, while waiting for available flights to the United States, since she was not able to enter Cuba. Cushach stayed a bit longer at the resort before mysteriously disappearing. The only missing things from her room were the clothes she wore the night of her disappearance. Cushach befriended bartender Anthony Grant, whose behavior, including calling in sick for 4 days after her disappearance, seems noteworthy. Further investigations found evidence of Cushach in his car, but authorities don't consider him a suspect. A 2002 judge ruling says Cushach died of foul play, but there were no charges. Elizabeth Barraza and her husband lived in the neighborhood behind me. On January 25, 2019, someone drove up to the house as she was setting up for a garage sale. The person got out of their truck and walked up and shot her several times and then drove away. We have surveillance video from a neighbor and it shows the whole thing, but there still hasn't been a suspect named. The Harris County Police are at a loss. It was so early in the morning that the light was still low, so it's hard to tell if the person is even a male or female. Elizabeth was a wonderful person. She was heavily involved in a volunteer group that would visit hospitals dressed as characters from Star Wars. Her marriage was great. There's just no reason for someone to want to kill her. So over a year later, there's been nothing. All we know right now is that a random person just drove up and shot Elizabeth in her driveway. The USS Cyclops disappearance. A US Navy ship vanished without a trace with over 300 men on board in the Bermuda Triangle in 1918. What's even creepier is that 2 of her sister ships also vanished on that same route in the 1940s. Her other sister ship was renamed the USS Langley and converted into America's first aircraft carrier. The loss of the Cyclops is the largest non-combat loss of life in Navy history. One theory I heard about Bermuda Triangle in general is that there may be methane vents underwater, so methane bubbles up to the surface, changing the density of the water, which could sink ships, as well as the density of the air, which could sink planes, but not sure if that's been investigated further. Branson Perry disappeared from his own backyard in 2001. He had friends over to help get his house in order for his dad, who was coming home from the hospital. He went to the backyard to put something away in the shed and no one saw him again. His dad came home like a week later than expected, so his disappearance wasn't reported till later. But what about the friends that were there with him? Did they not notice his disappearance? Why didn't they look for him? Then when police checked the shed, the item he was returning wasn't there, but shows up randomly like 2 weeks later. Apparently he had a history of drug use, and his dad had just caught him sleeping with a male friend the week before he disappeared or something. Somehow police came to the conclusion that he hitchhiked somewhere. They arrested a guy who would pick up young male hitchhikers and kill them, and he admitted to many murders but not Brandon. It's not eerie or chilling per se. There's just so many random facts about the case that don't seem to have any correlation. What's even stranger is that his cousin was actually murdered a few years after him. Some woman murdered her and removed her unborn baby from her stomach. That poor family. What are the odds? In early 1945, a Boston hospital received an unconscious patient suffering serious injuries, including infected shrapnel wounds. The hospital was taking in injured seamen from several US ships, and no one bothered asking questions as they started treatment. But someone wrote on a card, Charles A. Jameson, 49, religion Catholic, American, Cutty Sark. After extensive treatment, Jameson slowly improved to the point he could speak. Unfortunately, he seemed to be suffering amnesia, and what little information he could give couldn't be matched to any records. There was no US enlisted man named Charles Jameson, or any variation, who was unaccounted for. The patient's fingerprints and photos were checked against military and criminal records with no match. No ship named Cutty Sark was listed in the US military. There was one used by the British Navy. This seemed promising, as among Jameson's distinctive tattoos was one with the US and British flags, and he recalled living in London and training at a British gunnery school. But the British vice consul, who felt Jameson spoke with a British accent, sent his information to the Admiralty and the British Maritime Registry, who couldn't match it to any sailor. Despite record searches in both the US and the UK and widespread newspaper coverage, no one was ever able to figure out who Charles Jameson was. He spent 30 years in the hospital before he died with no solid identity. The Arushi Talwar case in Delhi. Teenage girl, throat slit in the middle of the night inside her own bedroom. Bloody handprints found on the terrace of the house. Arrested a few likely suspects but then inexplicably let them go and arrested the parents instead. Parents later let out on bail. Case still remains unsolved and the motive still unknown. Chills my heart to think about it. The police actually botched up the investigation by contaminating crime scene. Also the next day, body of the maid, male, was discovered from water tank. Maybe the maid killed the daughter and later the maid was killed by her parents. It still remained a mystery. The Delphi murders. 2 girls murdered while ousted for a walk at the Monon High Bridge near Delphi, Indiana. Cops literally have a video and voice recording of the guy who did it and have never identified the murderer. The Lake Bodom murders. 4 teenagers, 2 young couples, were brutally attacked while camping. The sole survivor underwent hypnosis to try to identify the murderer. Many criticized this method and dismissed it as nonsense, noting the sketch didn't really look like a real person, except for the fact that a man who looked just like it was photographed at a memorial service for the murders. He was never identified. The missing, kidnapped Iowa paperboys Johnny Gosch and Eugene Martin in the early 80s. I was a young kid then, and it scared me and oddly still does now. Netflix had a documentary on Johnny a few years back that was very chilling. From Johnny Gosch's Wikipedia. His mother, Noreen Gosch, claimed that Johnny escaped from his captors and visited her with an unidentified man in March 1997. She claimed that her son told her that he had been the victim of a pedophile organization and had been cast aside when he was too old, but subsequently feared for his life and lived under an assumed identity, feeling it was not safe to return home. The disappearance of Timothy Pitson. He was a 6-year-old who was dropped off at a school by his father and then later picked up by his mother, who took him on a 3-day vacation seeing various amusement parks. Her body was later found in a motel room, dead from a suicide, but Timothy was never found. Her suicide note claimed Timothy was safe but would never be found, and since 2011 no trace of him has ever been discovered, dead or alive. The idea that she took him to all these wonderful places in a bid to show him an amazing time in what very well was the last days of his life fills me with so much sorrow and sends chill down my spine. It's just a case I think about often. The Dutch girls that went lost in the jungle of Panama. I think one of the cell phones and camera were found, with pictures of the dark. Apparently they tried to use the flash to light their way for a moment. Weird thing is that it was extremely unlikely that they would go away from the path. I don't know, maybe it just seems extremely sad to me. The three men who made a master plan to escape Alcatraz Island. It was thought out so well and no one expected it. They started their way out after lights were out and everyone was in a cell and the guards weren't on duty. It was nighttime in June, so the waters always cool down. Many think they escaped on a raft and made it somewhere safe. Others are unsure and think they might have drowned or froze in the water. To think if they succeeded or not makes my chest quiver. The way I see it, those three are the reason the prison closed down. Several of the Anglin siblings claim they received sporadic letters from their brothers for years after the escape, and their mother got anonymous flowers every Mother's Day. A family friend claimed to have taken a photo of the brother in Brazil in the 1970s. There's a strong resemblance, but both men are wearing sunglasses and one has a beard, so it's not definitive. Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. It seems certain that a crime was committed, but it's very unclear who committed it and why. They now think that it was a pilot's suicide. The captain was in dire financial trouble and seems to have deliberately taken the plane out over the Southern Ocean, where it's likely never to be found. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell for more videos.